Thank you, Ambassador Mori, once again for your support and for your office for coordinating this event. So some of you might know that we actually initially planned to have this conference several months ago in early May, but I think it's rather fortuitous that we have postponed to this moment. Consider the things that have happened in the interim. We have a new prime minister in Japan. We've elected a new president in the United States. We've inaugurated a new leader in Taiwan. We've impeached a leader in South Korea. The North Korea-Russia partnership has deepened and cemented. And meanwhile, conflicts in the Middle East and in Ukraine continue to rage on. The alliance, the U.S.-Japan alliance has very much endured during this time and even thrived. And even though we may be at an inflection point, inaugurating a new president in the United States in Washington in just a few days, I'd like for this panel to first sort of pause and appraise the state of the relationship right now. It's become almost cliche to say that the U.S.-Japan alliance is at its greatest state ever, stronger than ever before. But let's unpack that a little bit and talk about all the various initiatives that the U.S. and Japan have pursued bilaterally. I think that I will first introduce the panel, and then we'll get right into the questions. We have a really stellar panel of people here, all very thoughtful and very experienced. To my right is Ambassador Masafumi Ishii, former Japanese ambassador to Indonesia, NATO, and Brussels, and currently a special adjunct professor at Gakuin University at the Faculty of Law. Beside Ambassador Ishii is one of our own, Takako Hikotani, a senior fellow at ASPI at the Tokyo Center, and also a professor at Gakuin University. Matthew Goodman, has several titles, but I'm going to stick with Distinguished Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as Director of the Greenberg Center for Geoeconomics. And finally, beaming in from Washington, hi Mira, is Mira Rapp-Hooper. She is the outgoing Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Asia and Oceania. Thanks very much in your last days in this role for joining our panel. So let's start with Matt. We're in New York, we're in the Finance Center, and economic security has been a very hot topic globally. Can you talk a little bit about how the US and Japan have put this on the agenda? What have been the challenges in implementing it, and where do we stand now?
Great, thanks, Emma, and thank you to the Asia Society for including me in this. What a fantastic panel, and I'm humbled to be up here, so I appreciate it. Yes, it's really unusual to start with economics, which is, I think, a sign of how far we've come in our relationship, because when I started working on Japan, we had a much different economic relationship. Let me tell a story, because Ishii-sensei, Ambassador Ishii is up here, and I think it was about 2008, he was the political minister in the Japanese embassy in Washington. We had breakfast. I can't remember what I was doing, and he told me something that I didn't know, which is that Article 2 of the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty talks about the United States and Japan working together to establish free institutions, to set aside their economic differences, and to work together on international economic cooperation. That's Article 2 of the Security Treaty, not 22. So economics has actually been at the top of the agenda for Japan and the U.S., for 50, 60 years. And I would say that measured by, and he was advocating that we try and do some big splashy thing, and we did a little thing, but I don't think we were able to pull it off quite in the way that I would have liked. But I think we've made a huge amount of progress in fulfilling the mandate of Article 2 over the last number of years. First of all, setting aside a lot of those trade frictions, not all of them, and we're going to talk more about some possibly new ones that are going to be arising. But I think it's extraordinary if you think where we were, 20, 30 years ago, how far we've come in setting aside those differences and working together in a number of arenas, including trade, but development, cooperation, and then, as you say, more recently, economic security. And you said what the U.S. and Japan have done to put this on the agenda. I actually think Japan is the one that gets the credit for putting this on the agenda. The U.S. Has had various forms of tools of intervention in the market to address risks, and that's basically what economic security is about, is trying to mitigate risks to national security or to the kind of foundations of the economy through things like export controls and investment screening mechanisms and responses to economic coercion and so forth. Japan really put this on the agenda in the bilateral relationship and beyond when they hosted the G7 last, now I got to say the year before last, 2023. They brokered the first statement by the G7 on economic security with seven different areas of activity and commitment to work together. So this has been a huge move forward in the relationship, which I think Japan gets a lot of credit for in trying to organize and get the two sides to work together. So we've done a lot of things that are both setting up legal mechanisms, aligning our approaches, consulting a lot on how we should mitigate those risks together. And I think this is, to me, the most sort of striking and important part of the relationship, which I think is going to continue going forward with some changes that we can talk about.
Great, thank you, Matt. Mira, I'd like to turn to you now. You are very much one of the architects of the U.S. Strategy in the Indo-Pacific, and we know all about this proliferation of minilaterals that have happened while you've been there at the White House. So can you give us sort of an insider look at how you built this lattice work, as they like to call it in Washington, how you centered the U.S. Japan alliance in those efforts, as well as any of the challenges that arose as you were putting this together?
Yeah, of course, Emma. Thank you so much. And thanks to the Asia Society for having me on this wonderful panel and as part of such a great lineup. I regret that you're getting me as a floating head on a screen and not there in person. But as Emma says, I had to stick back here in Washington in the final days of the Biden administration as we wind down our work. So I'm glad to be here in this capacity. I'll just start by saying that one of the most extraordinary privileges of my time at the National Security Council this last 4 years has been getting to work on the U.S.-Japan alliance and with Japan on this proliferating number of minilaterals during this period of such immense change and progress. As Emma indicated, some of this change was really purposeful and intentional on the U.S. side. But as Matt properly ascribed, I'll also note that I think a huge amount of the success that we saw in our Indo-Pacific strategy is owing to the initiative, the foresight, the creativity that was taken by the Japanese government and Japanese friends. So I'll unpack that a little bit more. From the U.S. perspective, the theory of the case of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy has really been that by investing in our alliances and in modernizing them to meet current day challenges, we could build the collective capacity that was needed to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open. Overlaid over our critical treaty alliances, like none more important than the U.S.-Japan alliance, of course, have been our efforts to craft these new minilateral groupings that will allow us to build additional collective capacity directed towards specific tasks. So, of course, there we're talking about the Quad, we're talking about AUKUS, we're talking about U.S. ROK, Japan Trilat, and as you will have seen, President Biden just held his second and final Trilat amongst the United States, Japan, and the Philippines just this past Sunday evening. Now, from where we sit as we grade our own homework as our term comes to an end, this strategy has been overwhelmingly successful, and it's rare that an administration gets to say that about a regional strategy. But it's not just because we did a great job, although I think we did a decent job, but it's primarily because U.S. allies who are a part of the strategy stepped up bigger and in more significant ways than we really could have imagined when we published the strategy in early 2022. And none has done so more consequentially than Japan. Over the course of the last few years, we have had the opportunity to launch some critical new initiatives that really have brought us to new heights. And as we reflect on, what the next chapter will look like, I do think it's really important to measure the progress in just these last few years, because in another world and with a different set of leaders, the progress we have seen in the last 3 years in particular easily could have taken 10. But it has been otherwise because of the initiative on both sides of the Pacific. A great example, of course, is the fact that when Prime Minister Kishida visited Washington this past April, we celebrated our alliance to the elevation of a truly global partnership in which we're pursuing cooperation in pretty much every domain around the globe, but especially in the areas of defense, economic, and diplomatic cooperation. Over the course of the last several years, we've had the opportunity to leverage Japan's historic decision to increase its defense spending to 2% of GDP and to acquire new counterstrike capabilities. And when Prime Minister Kishida was here now just 9 months ago, we made several new announcements that really gave you a sense of the heights to which this alliance has come. Those included our decision to upgrade our bilateral command and control architecture in Japan as Japan stands up its own Joint Operations Command Center. It included our decision to co-produce advanced capabilities in Japan, including long-range munitions. And that is work that has moved out fast and furious since the state visit. It culminated years of work to enhance our force posture and our bilateral exercises, especially in Japan's Southwest Islands. We announced that we would be expanding AUKUS Pillar 2 to include Japan in specific advanced capabilities projects. We announced that we'd be taking our space cooperation to new heights, including by announcing that a Japanese astronaut will be the first non-American to walk on the moon, and that a Japanese company will be developing the accompanying lunar rover. And of course, we expanded our multilateral cooperation within the lattice work of like-minded partners that we've already referred to, especially the ROK with the Philippines and with Quad nations. Now, what this has all amounted to, and in particular, the security cooperation in the U.S. Japan alliance has amounted to, is making deterrence in and around Japan more credible than it has ever been, and tooling up our security alliance for a completely new era. But as Matt has rightly noted, we have also expanded, I think, in critical ways, what we think as contributing to the U.S.-Japan security alliance. We've taken a broader lens to what it means to make our alliance secure and strong so that we can keep the Indo-Pacific the same. That has included significant progress on our expanded economic security cooperation, including on export controls and advanced technology. We've institutionalized cooperation on identifying and responding to economic coercion in the region, including and especially PRC restrictions on critical minerals exports, and expanding cooperation on strategic economic assistance projects like critical minerals projects in Australia and infrastructure projects in the Philippines. We've made huge progress in implementing all of the above because of the incredible levels of enthusiasm in both of our governments to take this alliance to the greatest possible heights that we could, and to make sure that these efforts within our bilateral alliance are reinforced by the efforts that we're working on minilaterally. But I do want to note that this is not a moment to just be self-congratulatory or to kind of rest on our laurels about what we have been able to achieve. The reason that we move so far, so fast in both of our governments is because these movements, whether on security or economics or diplomacy or in multilateral institutions, were critically necessary for us to be able to meet our strategic objectives that are more aligned than ever. So while I think that as a Biden administration, we are handing over a remarkable set of achievements for the next administration to build upon, I also want to counsel that it will require continued, diligent, relentless diplomacy on both sides of the Pacific to keep this work up, because the challenges are evolving incredibly quickly. And I know we have the capacity to meet them and continue to do so as an extraordinary alliance, but that this will continue to rely on the incredible dedication of governments in both Washington and in Tokyo. So why don't I stop there for now?
Thank you, Mira, for that very comprehensive rundown. I'd like to turn to Hikotani to focus on the Japanese perspective, from focusing on the military alliance. You've looked at this relationship and many of the SDF forces there. What do you think of as the most important aspects of alliance modernization?
Thank you, Emma. First, I'm really happy to be here. I was teaching at Columbia for 5 years until 2021. And I mentioned that because the book that I signed in my final semester was Dr. Hopper's Shoals of the Republic. And I was actually rereading that this past week to prepare for this conference, because in a way, it sort of goes down the list of what needed to be done. And you already said that you would grade what happened to be really, you'll give a positive grade to what happened in the past 4 years, I understand, from what needs to be done in terms of alliance modernization. But it has almost everything that happened already in the book about what should happen in alliance modernization. And I was quite amazed by that. And so I was going to ask you, what grade would you give as president of administration if you were to look back, but you already gave the grade, so thank you. But in some ways, I think it's rather not surprising for that reason that I might sort of overlap with what you just said, because I think the Japanese perspective on what was accomplished in the past 4 years is just as remarkable, as you mentioned, and that I do think that maybe it's worth, though, to go over it from a Japanese perspective, what that meant. Because I think for Japan, the alliance and modernization had 3 basic components. One is, Japan does more. 2, Japan does more with the U.S. And Japan and the U.S. does together more with other countries together. So basically, there's 3 components to that. And that, and I guess we do have to talk about maybe later this session how much is going to survive and what aspects of these 3 is going to be the most challenging going forward. But just in terms of what Japan does more in the alliance relationship, I do think that the upgrading of the alliance was long overdue. And the important part of the alliance modernization was to sort of change what the expected roles division of labor was between the U.S. and Japan, where Japan was an alliance's defensive shield, and the U.S. was an offensive spear. And that was pretty, something that's very difficult to break from. But I think that happened, and also now there's more emphasis on integration, not just coordination. But there's a long list of things that needs to be done for integration. But I think just changing the mindset about how there's like a strict division of labor, and this is what Japan does, what the U.S. does, to an alliance that does things together is the major change in what the alliance is about. And Japan does more, not just in terms of the responsibilities, but in terms of increasing defense spending and to possess counter-strike capabilities. So Japan does more in that sense. And I think there are challenges ahead in terms of the defense budget part of it, but still I think that transition was made quite clearly. And I do think that it's important to note that some aspects of it is for Japan to be able to do more on its own. But I think the more on its own is mostly as a means to enhance the U.S. Japan alliance, and it's not the ends of doing more. But I do think there's sort of a complex situation for Japan, that it looks like Japan can do more things independently, but in fact, a lot of it is very much integrated with the U.S. Japan alliance. So it's not really breaking away in a way, but it's true that Japan does more. Second is Japan and U.S. does more together. And there's a couple of aspects to it that Mira already covered. One is the important one is upgrading alliance command and control. And that is corresponding to Japan's own efforts to establish a joint operations command. The acronym is JJOC. I don't know how that sounds to you, but why JJOC? Why? Because one, as in many militaries across the world, Japan's 3 forces was not as integrated, and there is more desire to have more seamless response to contingencies that are not. It's not desirable to just come up with ad hoc joint command. So they decided to establish a permanent joint command and to deal with cross-domain operations. But I think most importantly, and I wonder how the American side believes, but I think the very important factor is coordination with U.S. PACOM. So I think that because the joint forces in Japan, although it wasn't a command, everything that had to do jointly had a lot to do with the U.S. counterpart, and there was always a need, and this is not something that sprang very recently, that there was a desire to have more jointness among the Japanese forces, and a driving force has always been the jointness in the U.S. forces, and I think it's interesting that it happened in a way it did, and I'm glad that it's happening. There's challenges ahead, as we can talk about later. And the other is the industrial aspect. There is something called the DICAS. Like, I have to look at my notes because it's a Forum on Defense Industrial Cooperation, Acquisition, and Sustainment. Basically, the industries are led by MOD and DOD to identify priority areas for partnering U.S. and Japanese industry, including co-development, co-production, and co-sustainment, and also leveraging the regional maintenance and repair capabilities. All of this is for Japan and U.S. to do together as an alliance. Finally, I think I will leave the third component to Ambassador Ishii, but Japan and U.S. does more with other countries. And there's an excellent ASPI notes for the Trump administration about talking about the AUKUS and AUKUS Pillar 2 and how many countries need to be incorporated in that. But Japan and the U.S. together, especially the ROK part, I think has been very important. And that is also facing a challenge right now. So I'd like to conclude by quoting Ambassador Emmanuel, who I guess is outgoing or has already been gone. Okay, gone. He said when he came to, what? Okay. Okay, you just freaked me out. But anyway, he mentioned when he came to Japan that the next 3 years will be important for the next 30 years of the alliance. And that basically meant what his tenure was going to be. And he's been giving some farewell speeches here and there. And I do think that it's not just him to take credit for everything, but I think in terms of the alliance, a lot of things happened in the past 3 years. And I think it's going to be very important for the 30 years going forward. And we can turn to the challenges ahead for that after this. So thank you.
Thank you, Takako, and thank you also for that prompt to tell the audience that hard copies of the ASPI notes for the Trump administration are available outside, so please pick up a copy there. Ambassador Ishii, let's widen the aperture a little bit and ask you to talk about U.S.-Japan cooperative efforts with Southeast Asia as well as with Europe. We've seen the Indo-Pacific 4, the IP4, develop a partnership with NATO. I'd love to hear how you think that has developed, and as well as whether or not U.S.-Japan initiatives, particularly in Southeast Asia, are complementary, are they different, and what have we accomplished in the last several years? Thank you.
Okay, many things have been said already. So first, it's great to be back. As Matt was saying, I was based in Washington, D.C. between 2006 and 2008, one of good old days. And then my task over there was to reach out to both camps, Obama camp as well as the McCain camp, to tell them what Japan wants to do once they become president. And one of which was, the 2010 happened to be the 50th anniversary of the conclusion of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. So we are planning to have some sort of celebration over that, plus adoption of a very tangible joint statement. So that's what we are proposing to both parties before the election actually took place. And since then, my impression, we have come all the way. It's been 15 years, many years ago. And then I think a base of our alliance has been expanded wider than ever, and the density of cooperation is closer than ever. And another thing before entering into the substance to mention is I'm very encouraged to see all these you guys turning out, because it's freezing out there. So I think you have something to talk to, you have some contribution to make to be here. So I'm very much encouraged to see that there is a wide-ranging interest among Americans, not only based on the Japan Steel issue, but for the alliance. So I'm very much encouraged by the spreading of the real interest in the strengthening the Japan-U.S. security alliance. Having said that, I think what we have done in the past 15 years, threefolds, as Hikotani-san was mentioning. First is the strengthening bilateral alliance. We have done a lot. We decided to increase our defense spending up to 2% by 2027, which is unprecedented, I think. It's politically unbelievable when I was here in Washington, D.C. to achieve 2% of GDP. It was out of the agenda. But now it's really in the center of the agenda. So we have come all the way. And the strike capability was also quite new. Counter-strike capability is quite a new thing. And modernizing command and control is actually part and parcel to make the alliance more operational, because there are so many challenges in front of us, and then we may have to really use the alliance our objective has been not to use the alliance and by creating the deterrence to stop any potential enemy from doing anything bad. But now it may happen, so we should be more ready to fight the war, if necessary. So for that purpose, I think to have the really operational command and control system is crucial. So I think it's a small thing, it sounds like technical, but it's a part and parcel to make the alliance more operational and realistic. That's one bilateral context. Second is expanding a base of security cooperation. Mira was talking a lot about lattice. Actually, in 2008, when we proposed the ways to strengthen our alliance, we already talked about the trilaterals, networking, lattice. We didn't use the word of lattice, but I think networking idea was already there because we believe then and now that nowadays we are talking a lot about the network of instability, tyrants, authoritarianism like DPRK, Iran, China, and Russia. But there is also a network for stability. Countries who are able and ready to support the rule-based order. And then there are so many pillars. One is North America, United States and Canada. Two is Europe. Third is Japan, Korea, Australia, and other democracies in Asia. So our task is to maximize the coordination, cooperation among these three pillars. So I think, as Emma was saying, establishing network with very important partners in Asia, Southeast Asian countries, by establishing the trilateral among Japan, U.S., the Philippines, which is crucial for deterring what may happen in Taiwan Strait. And I think the U.S. has extended their support to other countries like Indonesia by doing serious regular joint exercises, including Japan. I think I was very impressed to see that Japanese Army, U.S. Army, and Indonesian Army did an operation near the area where actually Imperial Army of Japan first invaded into Indonesia. It's in Sumatra, Palembang. So I think it means our cooperation has entered into a new era. And then bringing in all the future potential important partners in Southeast Asia can make the base of our security cooperation much stronger. And let us not forget another big guy, that is NATO. I think we also succeeded in bringing in NATO in our network. We finally succeeded in letting them refer to the situation in Asia in their strategic document, which is called a strategic concept. And then even after Ukraine happened, they focused on Russia solely. But well, once again, I mean, I'm afraid China made a little bit of mistake. And then when we asked NATO countries to include a reference to the situation security situation in Indo-Pacific, which is interrelated with the situation in Europe, European countries said, even after the Ukraine war happened, yes, of course, simply because they came to realize that in order to fight with Russia, you have to fight with China as well. So they refer to China as a systemic challenge. So I think that these two references, situation in Indo-Pacific and situation in Europe, are interrelated, and also China is a systemic challenge for NATO. These are the very important developments we have made to strike best possible coordination, cooperation among the, as I said, pillars of the stability, pillars for stability. So that's the second area. Third area is applied to a more specific conflict, which is Ukraine. I think, of course, we cannot do the same things as U.S. does. There is some restriction for us to sort of supply arms system to Ukraine. But we are happily part of the sanction regime. We are happily part of the efforts to support the efforts of the Ukraine government to fight against the country which clearly violated the basic principles of international law. So I think our cooperation in Ukraine, over Ukraine, is another example where we have come to different stage. different era of our cooperation. It has widened the subject of the Japan-U.S. Security Alliance. And so now I can comfortably say that the Japan-U.S. Security Alliance is, well, indispensable in talking about the future stability of the world, and then to sustain the rule-based order. And then as well, the Kishida said in the Congress a couple of months ago, we still need you. We still need the United States to do the job, but you don't have to do it by yourself. We are there to support. I think that is a basic and most important concept we have identified throughout these Biden, Kishida, Ishiba era.
Great. Thank you so much, Ambassador Ishii. So with that table set of the list of accomplishments and U.S. Japan cooperation, let's turn to this prospects going forward. Going back to Matthew, we can't let you out of here without talking about the Nippon Steel deal that's in the headlines now. To what extent do you think that sort of exposes some of the limitations of the friendshoring approach? And what are some of the broader implications for U.S. Japan investment?
Yes, I mean, Nippon Steel, I think, was not a wise decision, just to put that on the table. I don't think it advances U.S. interests in a number of ways. And I think it was an unfortunate decision. I think that it was a, unique situation, a combination of timing, geography, and sector. In an election year in Pennsylvania, in a sector as sensitive as steel, it was a particularly problematic transaction, certainly from President Biden's point of view. But I think that it was unfortunate, and I think is going to be interpreted not just by Japanese investors, but by investors from other partner countries. I've talked to a German CEO the other day who's worried about, not greenfield investment in the United States. To your point about friendshoring, I think there's a feeling that if a foreign investor comes in and establishes new production and creates new American jobs, that will be welcome. But if you're acquiring existing assets, certainly in a sensitive sector, but even maybe more broadly, I think there's definitely conversation in boardrooms around the world about whether the U.S. is a friendly place. And I think that's not in our interest for country investors from those countries to be thinking that way. And I think it is a tension in the Biden administration approach that I have actually wrote about on the first full day of the Biden administration. I didn't predict the Nippon Steel thing, but I pointed out that there is this tension between the impulse that I think is real in the Biden administration to work with allies and partners, and there's been a lot of tangible results from that and work from that has been done in that area, and this desire to rebuild in the United States. By itself, that is a very good thing. As a citizen, I'm glad that government is intervening to do those things and to promote private investment in the U.S. But it gets intermingled with politics and becomes, and certainly in the perception of, I think, some of our foreign partners, a kind of discriminatory approach to rebuilding America. That was not only true in a case like Nippon Steel, but in the case of the early rollout of the Inflation Reduction Act, which overall, I think, as the administration stressed, is very big picture in the interest of the world. If the U.S. can invest in these clean technologies, that will help the world and bring down the price of those things and create new innovative solutions. But in specific terms, that law, as it was first rolled out, was perceived as favoring American interests over some of our partners' interests. So I think that tension has been in our policy. Again, I think it's been there for a while. It isn't just during the Biden administration. I expect it to be manifest in other ways in the upcoming Trump administration, second Trump administration. Though interestingly, just since you're asking about Nippon Steel, I'll finish on that by saying that, I was asked on a panel yesterday, is President Trump going to reverse the decision on Nippon Steel? And I said, if you'd asked me that question a couple of weeks ago, I would have said, you're crazy. I mean, President-elect Trump has said, that he's opposed to this deal as well. But then I started thinking about it, and I think there are at least 3 reasons why it's possible. I still think not likely, but possible that President Trump could reverse this decision. One is politics. The same pressures that caused President Biden to delay the decision until after the election, which I think related to the fact that at the end of the day, there are probably more people in Pennsylvania that support this transaction than there are who oppose it. And so politically, it's actually not in line with what I think is the view, and certainly in the U.S. Steel Corporation. I think there are probably more workers who want this transaction to go through. And I think President Trump's going to be subject to that pressure as well. Secondly, the Trump approach of rebuilding America, making America great again, I think is very much involved the notion of pulling in foreign investment to support American production and jobs as well. It's very much aligned with that, and this transaction would advance those interests. And then thirdly, it sounds superficial, but I believe there's truth, and it's an analytically verifiable point, that because it was his predecessor's decision, that President Trump will just reverse it because, I know that sounds silly, but I think there's evidence that that is the way President Trump has operated before. So.
Great, thank you for that. Mira, I'd like to ask you, you very articulately laid out all of these partnerships, the web, the connection of security partnerships in Indo-Pacific. Which of those do you think are the most at risk of falling apart? And particularly, do you see if the United States is less engaged in a multilateral way in the region, do you see some of the linkages between the other partners in the region sort of sticking together and moving those initiatives forward?
Thanks, Emma. So I'll start by saying that I think all of the partnerships that I've referred to, U.S. ROK, Japan, Quad, AUKUS, U.S. Japan, Philippines, all of them has a fundamental strategic use case that is not about any one administration. Over the course of the Biden administration, we have seen bipartisan support really endure and strengthen for all of these partnerships. And from my interactions with the transition teams, although I will sort of make no projections about the next administration's policy, there should be good reason to continue supporting them all and to see strong U.S. leadership continue within them all. Part of the reason we have sort of evolved this minilateral system is exactly because these partnerships are intended to be fit for purpose. There was no effort made to sort of pull together one larger multilateral grouping, but rather to erect this series of partnerships where the objectives of each partnership would be crystal clear to those who are members. So when a new incoming team reviews the progress that we've made, they will see very clearly that in every case, the deliverables that we've announced at a given leader level summit, or the massive program of work that has taken place at the working level in the weeks and months since those summits, really all are in support of critical U.S. objectives that happen to be closely aligned with those of our allies. So I think that the case for continuing them all is clear. And again, I want to reinforce the fact that early evidence of bipartisan support is strong. Nowhere is that more obvious than in the Quad, which of course began as a foreign ministerial initiative under the first Trump administration. The Biden administration and our closest partners took it to the leader level and have made enormous progress through the Quad since. But I think the foundation is laid for the second Trump administration to pick back up that ball and continue running with it down the field. Now, within any of these minilateral partnerships, I expect that there may be some changes just because the strategic use case is crystal clear and there is bipartisan support, doesn't mean that a new administration will approach those partnerships in exactly the same way. And part of the exercise that a new team goes through with our partners over the course of the next few weeks and months will be to redefine some of the work that is done through these partnerships and, in all likelihood, to talk about these partnerships in a different way. As an example, we've had a lot of success in the region in describing the Quad as a partnership that is intended to deliver public goods, particularly in the Pacific Islands, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. And a lot of the support that we've seen grow from the Quad in the region is due to the fact that this partnership has actually demonstrated that through concrete projects, whether those be in areas like maritime domain awareness or launching new 5G pilot projects or cooperating on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief or holding our first Coast Guard exercise, that by delivering those public goods, we show the region that we actually are partners who are here for them. Now, although that's been really successful for the Biden administration, I don't know that the next administration will take the exact same approach to the Quad. So part of what we will see unfold in the coming months is that process of redefining these partnerships, how they will be talked about, how they will be purposed. And I think we can expect change to some degree within all of them. But I do think that the partnerships themselves are strong enough that they can very much withstand a rebranding. And the region can accept that as well. But I'll come back, Emma, when it comes to your question about risks, to a point that I made in my opening comments. And that is the fact that when you have not only these incredibly strong treaty alliances, but you will also have this incredible diversity of partnerships that operate across American and partner departments and agencies at every level of government, and with programs of work that depend on really concrete resources and practical outputs, it is a tremendous amount of work and commitment that is required to drive these partnerships forward. They are not and will never be on autopilot, and they are incredibly useful and serve a critical role where they are applied. But a new team will have to figure out how exactly they're going to organize that work, how exactly they're going to resource that work, and how they will keep up the momentum and the day-to-day attention that is required to keep that strategic alignment up, as well as all of these practical outcomes ongoing. But of course, happy to talk more about any of this with our excellent panelists.
Just one follow-up to that, Mira. I wonder if you could comment specifically on the U.S. Japan ROK trilateral. I mean, this is not just about how the U.S. is engaged in this, but of course leaders in Seoul and Tokyo. Given what we've seen happen in Seoul over the last several weeks, do you think this trilateral partnership is it maimed? Is it dead? Is it going to resurrect? Just any comments you have on that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with the bottom line up front. It is neither maimed nor dead. It is very much alive, although I expect that the momentum behind it will change somewhat and its shape will look a little bit different. But I do believe that the work that we have done together will stand the test of time and that its case has been proven. I'll back up to support that with some fact. We knew when we had this incredible moment of opening, the rapprochement between Japan and the ROK, and then the first trilateral leader summit of the new era that occurred at Camp David, that this moment would not remain as open forever. Political change is always baked into the cake in three strong democracies, and we have known that in the past, that moments of political change in the ROK or in Japan have sometimes led to backsliding in their relationship. So at that summit, if you kind of take a look back at the fact sheet, we made a very deliberate effort to try to create a set of incentives that would make it harder to reduce cooperation in the future when that political change inevitably occurred. And that occurred kind of along at least two dimensions. The first was that we made a very deliberate effort to seriously deepen on an accelerated pace cooperation where it may have already been ongoing, such as in the security space and when it comes to countering efforts and strengthening our cooperation against challenges like the DPRK. And that's why you've seen in such a short time since Camp David that we've moved out on implementing things like the sharing of missile warning data to make sure that all three of our countries are prepared to react to a DPRK provocation. We've moved out with an annual trilateral exercise program that has brought all of our militaries closer together. And along the way, you've seen continued progress between Japan and the ROK, like the decision mid-year last year to finally set aside the 2018 radar lock incident in the interest of deeper bilateral cooperation. So that cooperation really has deepened quite significantly. But we also made a decision along a different dimension to bring a lot of agencies and aspects of our government into cooperation with one another where they might not have been before. So that's why we launched cooperation in areas like economic security, in areas like development, people-to-people and educational ties, and a whole bunch of additional initiatives that now have agencies working together that had not done so on a trilateral basis before. And none of this work means that we are insulated perfectly from political change. But what it does mean is that we are increasingly proving to one another the value of continuing cooperation in a wide variety of areas and raising the costs of pulling back from that cooperation in the future. Now, I do believe, as I indicated, that the political crisis that has been unfolding in the ROK will have some reverberating effects, although the U.S. government has been clear and continues to be clear that we expect it to be managed peacefully in accordance with the ROK Constitution and in accordance with the basic principle of democratic resilience. And we continue to see that play out. Along the way, we have made clear in all of our messages, public and private, that the trilateral cooperation that we have achieved amongst the U.S., ROK, and Japan is now a new normal for us, that it is a core national interest of the United States that the ROK and Japan be able to cooperate in a wide variety of areas, and that the United States be able to count on our trilateral cooperation going forward as a critical component of our own security and stability in the Indo-Pacific. So while I do expect that there may be some change, I think we have sort of reset the floor for what it means to cooperate trilaterally. And we do expect that we will be able to sustain some of the really important work that we've achieved at Camp David going forward, even if its shape and contours change.
Great, thank you for that. Takako-san, let's talk about burden sharing. The host nation support or special measures agreement, SMA, agreement between the United States and Japan is due to expire fairly soon. These cost sharing contracts have been a focus, a target, I think, of President Trump in the past. So how do you see those negotiations unfolding? What's the case that Japan can make, too, that they're contributing more?
Thank you. Let me step back a little bit and talk about what's going to be okay, because I think that it's going to be hard. I do think that the past 4 years has been an effort to make the alliance make more sense. I think there's much more compared to 2016, that the alliance should make more sense for the U.S. due to its modernization. At first, I think Japan was a diligent student of Dr. Hooper about what needs to be done for the alliance to make sense for the U.S., and I think a lot of changes have been made. And I think there's a lot of things that are probably not going to be on the radar, and maybe even under the new president, because it's something that's more technical nature. But I do think that it's not just that we'll have a new president in the U.S., but we have a minority government right now in Japan, and I think that may continue longer after the upper house election in the summer. So in a way, we do have a very different situation than 2016, and that maybe the bilateral relationship, it might be more healthy, and what needs to be done has been done, but we do have the difficulty of the leadership. And on that point, I do think that the good news is that I do think that there might be worries that in Japan we don't have the Prime Minister Abe that got along with President Trump. But I do think that even if it's a minority government, on the issue of U.S.-Japan alliance, the opposition is, or the non-LDP parties are pretty much on the same page on the alliance issues that we talked about today, that only the Japanese Communist Party opposed to the defense-related bills that was necessary to change the JJOC and the status that has to do with the self-defense forces. And that is quite remarkable to me, because I started teaching at the Defense Academy from 1999. And it's really hard to imagine that the opposition, with the exception of the Communist Party, will be on board on that kind of effort. And that, since that is very much linked with the U.S. Japan alliance, for that to happen, on that, I think is something to note before we freak out about the situation in both countries. Having said that, I think the host nation support issue is going to be tricky, because it's not just the host nation support, or it's not called the host nation support anymore. I think it's now the budget to enhance the resilience of the alliance. So we're not supposed, I think that's the Japanese translation, because I think things that has to do with the budget, something that has a numerical aspect, is going to be a challenge, because it could be something that the new president is easy to notice. And also it's very difficult from Japan's point of view in terms of thinking about its fiscal situation. I think it's more likely that LDP the LDP will be in the administration one way or the other, because you only need a plurality to be a prime minister, but you need a majority to pass any bills. And I think budget is going to be very tricky every time. And so anything that has to do with increasing the defense budget is already very tricky. And so anything that has to do with the budget to enhance the resilience of the alliance is always going to be tricky if it's going to be looking like it really stands out. So that I worry, because although I think looking at public opinion, the Japanese public is in general agreement that the U.S. Japan alliance is very important. But it has always been challenging, even when we look at the discussions that had to do with the new national security strategy, that although people are okay with increasing the defense budget, they're not okay with paying more from their taxes, and they're uncomfortable with the government getting into deeper debt. So if the host nation support is tied to that issue, it gets very difficult. And also I do worry that these kind of numerical issues are easier to get on the political level than other things that's basically just going to happen. Although there's implementation challenge, I am worried about that for that reason.
Ambassador Ishii, as you know, and as you mentioned in your initial remarks, the conflict in Ukraine has been really an important aspect of U.S.-Japan cooperation globally. If that conflict comes to an end in some way or another, how do you think that affects Japanese engagement with Europe, particularly as we have seen just in the last couple of weeks, governments in France and in Germany and in Canada fall? What does that do to Japanese engagement with NATO and with the Western world?
I hope at least what we've been doing is the beginning of our engagement with European countries, which will not be over even after the war ends. And Japan has some expertise for the post-war development. So I think we will stay engaged. But at the same time, I think it's very important for us to realize that there has been a kind of fundamental change going on inside the United States as well as the international system, and which is not only for the coming 4 years, but also may last for much longer than that. I think I conceptualize them into three areas. First is from burden sharing to challenge sharing. My sense is in the past, U.S. has been good enough to move in to solve the international conflicts by itself, and the U.S. was able to do that, and then U.S. carries some legitimacy behind it. So everybody was happy to accept the U.S. intervention, U.S. solution U.S. have come up with. But the costs are involved. So U.S. only wanted allies and like-minded countries, Japan to share the costs. So that is a system of burden sharing. I think not anymore. We are moving into the era of selective engagement of the United States. I think U.S. will continue to stay engaged in many conflicts, Gaza, Ukraine. I think. But it's going to be selective. And I think countries like Japan, allies and like-minded countries have to engage more in solving the conflicts themselves. Otherwise, there will be nobody to stop the conflicts, and then the conflicts will continue forever, for a longer period of time, which comes with a lot of loss of lives, which is really against human dignity. So I think Japan should be more ready to engage in the solution of the conflict themselves. So that carries more. So that makes it more important for us to stay engaged in conflicts like Ukraine. So that's one issue. And the second issue is, I would say, rule by fear to rule by majority. I think coming up with a solution of international conflict are always very, very painful, and then you are under criticism because in order to come up with solution or the compromise, every party of the conflict has to come up with some sort of concession. So everybody will, at the end of the day, everybody will be unhappy because you have to make a concession. So I think U.S. did that job, and the U.S. was very strong against the criticism. Because what U.S. did, as I said, had some legitimacy behind this. That's part of the reason why those conflict parties accepted the solution U.S. came up with. And at the same time, U.S. is very strong, and U.S. is unpredictable if you criticize the United States. So I would call it the rule by fear. What U.S. did was accepted by all the conflict parties because they have reason to follow that, because out of fear of what the U.S. may do if you criticize the United States. But I think once, as I said, you are no longer ready to engage and try to solve the conflicts by itself. So I think we have to do it. Japan, European countries have to do it. And Japan, as you know, is very fragile to criticism. We don't want to criticize. So rather than sort of asking them to accept the compromise by fear, I think we will try to create majority of the international community support. If they support the compromise Japan came up with, that's much easier to implement. So I think rule by majority will become very important. That means we have more reason to try to engage what we call global South countries, those countries which become more important in future, like Indonesia, India, Brazil, other countries. So I think we need to do that. And some of the worry I have under the Trump administration in terms of the selective engagement and withdrawing from the international scene of international conflict is, I think the deal with China is the main focus, yeah? In addition to domestic priorities. So it is difficult to assume that the things like Philippines under attack from China in South China Sea is part of the deal. I think it's difficult to think that U.S. will continue to commit itself to support the Philippines, even if it's under Chinese bullying threat. So that's where countries like Japan have to engage, supporting the Philippines, supporting Indonesia, those Southeastern countries. And that makes sense because we need to bring them as a supporter and in order to create majority. Last thing is alliance is not privilege. I mean, that Japan Steel issue, should the United States accept the deal because Japan is the alliance partner? I don't think so. Being ally of the United States doesn't give you any merit. It's up to what you do exactly for the sake of the United States, or to be more exact, for the sake of President-elect, matters. So you have to start doing everything from the scratch. So that requires us to be more active in solving the international conflicts, making a lot of friends to create majority. So these will contribute to the strengthening of the U.S.-Japan Security Alliance as well, because we will be judged by the merits, judged by what kind of good things we can do for the sake of the United States.
Thank you. A reminder to the audience that you can submit questions via the QR code on the back of your program if you, when we move into a Q&A session in just a few minutes. But before we do that, Matt, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Japanese concern about universal tariffs possibly being imposed, and what impact would that have on the Japanese economy? Do you expect a response or retaliation?
Well, there's a lot of uncertainty around what President Trump is going to do on day one or, in his second term. But at the least uncertain end of the spectrum of uncertainty is that he is going to impose tariffs, I think, on day one, and I think he's going to go on the bigger end of the scale. There's a big debate about that in my world, about whether he's going to go relatively moderately forward on day one, which would basically mean signing things saying that he's going to impose Section 301 tariffs on unfair trade practices or Section 232 tariffs on national security-related, trade problems. That would be the sort of softer approach, or use the nuclear weapon of international economic policy, which is, and if you haven't learned this acronym, you need to start practicing it because you're going to hear it a lot, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, or IEPA, which is basically a piece of legislation that was passed in the Carter administration that basically gives the executive branch, or the president, once he declares an international economic emergency, which is pretty ill-defined, he can basically do anything he wants. And so that would be the bigger option. And I don't know that the president's going to do that, but I do think it's possible. And I, as I say, think he's going to go bigger than smaller early on. I think the only good news for Japan is that Japan probably ranks 5th or 6th on the president's lists of targets and concerns these days. I think it's more sort of, Canada and Mexico, China, Europe, Vietnam, once he sees the trade numbers and how they've been surging, our trade deficit with Vietnam has been exploding. And then Japan kind of ranks 5th or 6th down on the list. So I don't think Japan's going to be an early target. Of course, if he does universal, tariffs on, across the board, then of course Japan would be caught up in that. I think this is something that we all need to take literally and seriously. That this is a tool that the president-elect feels is very powerful. What's another uncertainty about it is whether it is a negotiating tool or an end in itself, or just something the president wants to put in place for punishment reasons or others. If it's a negotiating tool, then that suggests maybe a somewhat sort of more staged approach and an opportunity for trading partners like Japan to negotiate solutions before those tariffs are imposed. Again, I personally err more on the side of it's not so much a negotiating tool as it is kind of an end in itself, or something the president really wants to do. And so I think it's going to be harder to negotiate out of this situation. But if there is a deal that comes out of this to buy more U.S. agricultural exports, the easy one is natural gas, because Japan needs natural gas, and the president-elect says we're going to drill, baby, drill. So I think there's a good alignment there. But Japan doesn't really need our gas quite as much. Others in the region do, and so it could be, maybe they could be a broker role. That may be part of a solution. But I think this is something that's going to be a very central part of the U.S. Japan, the challenging part of the U.S. Japan economic relationship going forward.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take a couple of the questions that have come in. We have about 15 minutes left. Mira, I know that you have a hard stop then, so let me get to some of the questions that you may be able to answer. One is about specifically the future of the Quad under a Trump administration, and I wonder if you could comment on that based first of all on the experience in Trump's first term, as well as some of the domestic political stresses that may be in Delhi or Canberra or Tokyo.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, Emma. So I'll pick up on my prior answer, which is to say that I think early indications are, although I make no bones to be projecting anything about Trump administration policy, that the Quad will absolutely have a future in a second Trump administration. As I noted a few moments ago, the first two times the Quad met, it met at the foreign ministerial level in the second half of the first Trump administration. And that momentum, the fact that its clear strategic case was building, was part of the reason that we advised on the presidential transition in 2020 that President Biden should take the Quad to the leader level for the first time. So I think folks who are returning to the Trump administration see organic buy-in to this grouping, even if, as I already indicated, they might think about the types of projects they undertake or the rhetoric they use to describe the Quad somewhat differently than we have. But I also think the kind of buy-in, the antecedents of the next administration's support for the Quad are not just in the first Trump administration. I think we've seen a lot of indication over the course of the Biden administration that Republicans on Capitol Hill are hugely enthusiastic about the Quad. When we held the last Quad Summit in Wilmington, Delaware, we announced among our many deliverables a Quad Caucus, which was launched on a bipartisan, bicameral basis on Capitol Hill, and obviously intends to build amongst Quad legislatures deep connections and Quad initiatives of their own. And we believe that that is going to be sustained, and we're really happy that there was that enthusiasm for launching it, even when we did not know who the next U.S. president was going to be. That said, to your question about what might be challenging, part of what has been relatively easy for the Biden administration, and why I think our Indo-Pacific strategy has been a pretty strong success, is the fact that we made a very intentional decision that we would not force our closest allies and partners into a position where they felt that they were having to choose, much less choose publicly, between the United States and the PRC. And from our perspective, this is what has made it much easier for our partners in Southeast Asia, partners in South Asia, and partners in the Pacific Islands to work with us, because they felt that we were able to offer an affirmative vision and positive choices that didn't necessarily foreclose their ability to also work with the PRC in certain select areas or force them into a political confrontation that they felt that they couldn't afford. The big X factor that I would lay out is that if the Quad or another minilateral partnership is framed differently, and in particular, if its lens is a much more confrontational one when it comes to the way the United States relates to the PRC, does that potentially reduce the space, both for Quad partners themselves and for those who we wish to partner with in the region in these three critical sub-regions, to feel like they can do so comfortably and easily, which is part of the credibility that we have been building up through our work over the course of the last 4 years. Now, again, as I say, I think there's plenty of room for rebranding, and because the region really does want positive alternatives that are high quality and supported by all 4 Quad partners, there may be some tolerance for change. But I do think that dilemma, the question of what will happen to these minilateral partnerships if they are not just framed in a positive light, but rather take on a little bit more of a tenor of a confrontational approach, is an open question that we'll see start to play out over the coming weeks.
Great, thank you. We have a question about Japanese domestic politics that I'll turn to our Japanese speakers here. What is the likelihood that Japan will hold a simultaneous election for both the lower house and the upper house in summer 2025, which could clear up at least some of the political uncertainty in Tokyo about how to approach Trump during his second term? Any predictions on that from Hikotani-san or Ishii-san?
I'm not a political reporter, so I know that it is not possible, and I don't really know, as for the latter part of the question, whether it's going to clear up anything. I don't know, because I think it will depend on the configuration of the cabinet after the election. And so I don't know if that's going to be any divisive way. So I don't know. And what do you think, Professor Ishii?
I think Japanese politics will continue to be a little bit through an unstable period. But even though the government is a minority government, can still make a lot of things happen. And Ishiba knows it's a minority government, so he's ready to accept the proposal by opposition parties. And he has to do it in order to do important things like passing a budget. And passing budget is very important, big deal. So even opposition party will hesitate to ask Ishiba to do something dramatic. So I think there is a room for compromise. So I think Ishiba will continue to clear one hurdle and another hurdle. Of course, winning the upper house election scheduled in summer this year, is the biggest challenge for Ishiba. But I think his popularity is actually on the rise. So there are a lot of things which can happen between now and the upper house election. So I hesitate to make any definitive prediction, but I only want to tell you that don't think that minority government cannot do anything and the Japanese politics will be completely stalled. No, no, no. We will carry on, we will make things happen if necessary. So we will have to face with new president-elect. And I think minority government can do it.
We have another question here that asks about Congress, my favorite branch of the U.S. government. And the question, specifically on tariffs, if Trump imposed tariffs on Japan or does other things that are seen as being damaging to the U.S. Japan alliance. Matt, do you anticipate any pushback from Congress? And it points to this broader question about whether or not those in Congress, the Republicans in Congress particularly, are aligned with Trump on foreign policy and economic policy.
Yeah, well, it's an important question because, all of us who studied trade, we're taught over and over again that Congress is in charge of trade. Article 1, Section 8 says that Congress is responsible for commerce among nations. And so, one thought that Congress would have a lot more say over these issues. But it turns out that the executive branch actually has developed a lot of authority over time, even without specific designation from Congress to negotiate new trade agreements. And I mentioned some of the sort of alphabet soup or number soup of authorities that have been delegated over time, like Section 301, Section 232, IEPA. And so it turns out the executive branch has a lot of power to at least to raise tariffs using those authorities. And as I say, I expect President Trump in one way or another is going to use those authorities robustly, actively. There is pushback already in some quarters of Congress. There was a piece of legislation, I'm not sure if it's been resubmitted already, but probably will be by, admittedly, a group of Democrats questioning the president's use of IEPA, whether he can use it in the way that it was intended. And so I think you will see some of that. I think obviously with the Republicans having a majority in both houses, there are free trade and people in the Republican caucus. I even know a couple of them who are, I'm sure, uncomfortable with some of the direction of these policies. But whether the Republican caucus overall in both houses are really going to put up a fight to what the president wants to do in this area, which they know is his top priority, I'm not so sure. I think the constraint is going to be less Congress than it is the markets and, frankly, interest rates. If the president-elect implements half of the things he's talked about on trade, on immigration, deporting a lot of immigrants, or tax cuts, that is all, at least again in the theoretical textbooks, that's all going to be inflationary, which means interest rates go up, and that could constrain the president combined with, if he tries to use these tariffs. One little thing I heard just yesterday, and I haven't seen reports, I apologize if everybody knows this and I'm the only one who doesn't, but that the president-elect is talking about establishing an external revenue service to focus on, on tariffs. So, just to put a point under the fact that he thinks this is not only a negotiating tool, but it's something else. It's a source of revenue and other things. So I think this is going to be something he's going to follow through on, whatever Congress thinks. Okay,
we have one more question for Mira, and we will end there afterwards. It's a question saying you've said repeatedly that it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of diligence to keep the U.S.-Japan alliance strong. What would be some indicators of what that would look like in the next administration? What are the things that we should look for that shows that there are people, maybe at the top or maybe those at the working level, that there's really effort being put into maintaining this alliance?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a few things, and I'll say, on a very optimistic note, there may be some optimistic for the Indo-Pacific. There may be some areas in which our foreign policies are not aligned, but the early indications that we have gotten from the new incoming team is that our objectives and many of the tools that we're interested in using to pursue them are pretty closely aligned in the Indo-Pacific, including, we've had very thoughtful conversations through transition mechanisms about the role that these minilateral partnerships have played, what we've done inside the U.S.-Japan alliances and some of our other bilateral treaty alliances. And so all of those early indications really, really do give me a fair amount of hope that there is interest in doing that work. But to the question of what it would look like, a lot of the way that we have gotten our agenda done during the Biden administration is to sort of set up touchstone events that will be forcing functions that will require us to push through new and significant work streams that will then get maintained thereafter. This is sort of the basic battle rhythm of government, but I think that one of the great privileges of being in this administration is that the president, the secretary of state, the national security advisor, the secretary of defense, all really made time for our Indo-Pacific initiatives. They saw them as amongst the most important things they were working on. They cleared their calendars. They did the hard travel. They committed to meeting often multiple times a year in a variety of different formats to get that work done. So one of the early indicators you should look for is high-level meetings taking place both at the leader level and amongst principals. That could be an early leader level visit, certainly. It could be announcement of a 2+2 taking place. It could be bilateral visits to the region or to the United States. But the reason that those matter is not just because of the personal connections amongst the principals, which are important, but because those meetings are the occasion in which you can push through the next phase of the work and to make commitments about what will come after. So that's point number one. Point number two is that we will probably start to see some early indications of how the second Trump administration is thinking about its own Indo-Pacific strategy. Part of the reason that we published an Indo-Pacific strategy early on in the Biden administration was because the Trump administration had a framework of its own. And if they refresh that framework or they present a new one, develop a new one, we'll want to look out for how our bilateral alliance with Japan and how these minilateral partnerships feature in that new framework. Again, not because the document in and of itself is totally binding, but because it's a signal to the U.S. government about how new leadership is prioritizing its initiatives within the Indo-Pacific that we can expect to have some consistent role in implementation. But finally, I think a critical indicator will be how President Trump himself talks about and reacts towards, interacts with all of these initiatives. I think we all know very well that it is possible for the United States to speak with one coherent voice on the international stage, but it's also possible for the United States to sometimes speak with multiple voices. And at a moment that is as pivotal as the one that we find ourselves in now, for U.S. leadership to be sustained in the Indo-Pacific and for us to be able to play that critical role that we must play to keep the Indo-Pacific free and open alongside our closest allies and partners, it will be important not just that the region and everyone in this room see this regular tempo of meetings and deliverables and work products and strategies, but that the region feel that from top to bottom, we are speaking with one voice when it comes to what we intend to achieve and how we intend to achieve it. Now, that last piece is no small ask, but I do believe as someone who's had the great privilege of working on all these partnerships and seeing what they can do for the last several years, that we will see the same from the Trump administration, because I do believe, as I've said, that many of these objectives are shared and aligned. I'll stop there.
Perfect, and a good note to end on, something to look out for. We've covered a lot of ground. in this first panel. The next panel is going to look at how the alliance sort of navigates this really turbulent landscape ahead of us. But please join me in thanking all of our panelists for all the wisdom today.